Everything she said, from the very first word to the last, was being recorded. Every word she spoke was destined to be used against her. She threatened to destroy his life. And in a way, it was true. She tried, but with that one call, everything changed. She would never be able to hurt him again. Now her life was hanging by a thread, and it depended on him. All this time, while she enjoyed the show, she was the clown being watched with growing curiosity. The police were with him, guiding, orchestrating, and just when they began to doubt the case would ever be solved, the killer brought them closer to the truth than he ever intended. San Luis Obispo, California. Angel Gate Academy, run by the U.S. National Guard, was something akin to a boot camp, a place where mentors skillfully guided and taught valuable skills to young people who might otherwise have taken a wrong turn in life. It was here that Angelina first took notice of Jose Francisco Rodriguez, who preferred to be called Frank. Angie had already been married 3 times and was raising her daughter, Autumn. Frank was also divorced. Both Angie and Frank had military backgrounds, and they were drawn to the idea of working with troubled teens. Kind, empathetic, and able to connect easily with kids, Frank immediately caught Angie's attention. Frank had certainly taken notice of the attractive woman with large brown eyes and a warm, captivating smile. But behind Angelina's sincere expression were painful memories she rarely spoke about. She told Frank that when she was very young, her father had walked out on the family, leaving her mother to raise 2 daughters alone. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep them afloat, so Angelina was effectively raised by her older sister and their grandfather. Grandfather molested little Angelina from early childhood until almost the end of her school years. She herself was still essentially a child when she realized she was pregnant. Angie terminated the pregnancy. All this affected her so much that Angelina wanted to end her life. But she survived, moved away from her grandfather, and began to live independently. At 19, Angelina got married for the first time to Hector Gonzalez. But the marriage ended quickly. She married again, this time to Tom Fuller. During that marriage, she gave birth to 2 beautiful daughters, Autumn and Alicia. For a while, it seemed like Angelina's life was finally coming together, as if the universe was rewarding her for all the suffering she had endured in her youth. But fate had more heartbreak in store. When Alicia was just 13 months old, she died in her crib due to a defective pacifier. A part of it broke off and became lodged in her throat. Although the manufacturer would later recall all pacifiers of that model, it was too late for Alicia. The young couple couldn't recover from the tragedy, and they eventually separated. Angelina tried once more to find happiness in marriage with Don Combs. By the time she met Frank, Angelina had all but given up on love. But Frank believed they were soulmates. He was ready to care for her and her daughter, and he promised they would never have to suffer like that again. In April 2000, 41-year-old Frank and 32-year-old Angelina became husband and wife. Shortly after, Frank was offered a teaching position in the quiet Los Angeles suburb of Montebello. He accepted the job, and the family relocated. They were happy in their new home, but misfortune seemed to follow them. Not long after the wedding, a gas leak occurred in the house. If Frank hadn't noticed it in time, the consequences could have been catastrophic. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, September 9, 2000, before the sun had risen over the Los Angeles suburb of Montebello, a panicked woman called the police. She was terrified. Her husband had suddenly fallen ill, and she feared he wouldn't survive the night. By the time emergency responders arrived, the man was already dead. He was lying face down on the bedroom floor. He had vomited before dying and had a small amount of blood coming from his nose. Not unusual at death scenes. The deceased was 41-year-old Frank Rodriguez. The 911 call had come from his wife, Angelina. She told authorities that she had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV. When she woke up and went to the bedroom, she found Frank lying on the floor. He had vomited and was unresponsive. That's when she called for help. Angelina didn't cry, but the officers knew from experience that people grieve in different ways. She told them Frank hadn't been feeling well for the past few days. She had taken him to the hospital, where doctors suspected food poisoning. They advised her to keep him hydrated with fluids like Gatorade and tea, and to make sure he got plenty of rest. Angelina said she followed all the medical advice carefully, but Frank didn't improve. And that night, she found him on the bedroom floor. She told the officers she couldn't understand how food poisoning could have taken her husband's life. The officers didn't have an answer either. The coroner examined Frank's body. There were no signs of trauma or injury. Could it have been a heart attack? A stroke? The coroner took the body for autopsy to find out. Detectives asked for permission to look around the house. Angie agreed. The home was neat and orderly. There was no blood, nothing out of place, and no indication that Frank had tripped or fallen. Nothing at all seemed suspicious. The officers left Angelina to grieve and to notify Frank's family about his sudden, unexplained death. Frank grew up in Lincoln, Illinois. He was the eldest of 5 children. When he was 8 years old, his parents divorced. After his father left, young Frank stepped into the role of man of the house, taking care of his younger siblings, walking them to school, making breakfast. As he got older, he joined the Navy and served during the Gulf War, Desert Storm. He wrote to his mother regularly, kept her updated on his life, and sent her gifts from every country he visited. But like many young men suddenly thrust into the vastness of the world, Frank picked up a few bad habits. He began to drink. Fortunately, he recognized early on that he was heading down the wrong path, and he made the choice to quit drinking. That turning point is part of what made him so well suited to working with troubled teens at Angel Gate Academy, where he landed a job after 14 years of Navy service. It was there that he met Angie, and the two quickly fell in love. Just 5 months after his family had celebrated his wedding, they were receiving the devastating news of Frank's death. Like Angelina, they struggled to believe it, and even more so to accept it. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and found nothing. No signs of trauma from a blow, fall, gunshot, or stab wound. Frank's organs were in excellent condition. There were no signs of respiratory failure, no asthma-related issues. He was, by all accounts, a completely healthy man, except that he was dead. The autopsy raised more questions than it answered. The police began to think they had no choice but to rule the death as an unfortunate accident. But then they received a clue, one that would completely change the course of the investigation. Angelina wanted the detectives to know that there was someone who didn't like her husband, a former colleague from Angel Gate Academy. His name was Chad Holloway, and he had been accused of child abuse and even molestation. An investigation had been launched after someone reported him. According to Angelina, Chad held a grudge against Frank because he believed Frank had reported him. And since on the Wednesday before Frank's death, he had agreed to accompany a school bus to the camp, Angelina suspected that Chad had poisoned her husband. The next day, investigators went to the camp to speak with the staff, focusing especially on Chad. They interviewed about 20 people and discovered 2 important things. First, the allegations against Chad had already been thoroughly investigated and were completely unfounded. No one had ever believed them. Second, everyone at the academy loved Frank and considered him a friend, including Chad. On the other hand, Chad didn't deny being very angry at whoever had cast suspicion on him and threatened to find and punish that person. He said he had served in the military and been through a lot, but had never been as terrified as when he was accused of molesting children. Chad was genuinely furious, and according to the police, someone in that state might be driven to commit a crime. But there was one catch. Frank had agreed to accompany the kids on the trip to the camp at the very last minute. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and until Frank got off the bus in San Luis Obispo, no one at the camp knew he would be coming. Chad couldn't have known either, which meant he couldn't have prepared poison to kill the victim days later. It was unlikely that Chad always carried poison with him. There was more. Chad said that when he and Frank met, they hugged and chatted for a couple of minutes. Then Chad went to the kids, and Frank and the bus were supposed to head back to Los Angeles. Chad had no opportunity to slip anything into Frank's food or drink while he was at the camp. Moreover, everyone who saw Frank noted that he already looked unwell, sickly, thin, and a shadow of the man he used to be. Meanwhile, Frank's relatives arrived in Los Angeles to say their final goodbyes. After the church service, Angelina, Frank's sisters, and his mother got into a limousine that took them to the cemetery. As Frank's sisters discussed what could have caused such a sudden death, Angelina declared that he might have been poisoned. She pointed out a plant commonly found throughout the city, Oleandr. People often get poisoned by it. Looking out the window at the beautiful blooming bushes, she said, "That's oleander." Oleander, which grows along highways, especially in Central and Northern California, is indeed highly toxic. But why did she specifically mention it? Frank's sisters and mother were stunned by her suggestion. Even the coroner had no clue what caused the death. Later, the women called the sheriff's office and asked them to investigate the possibility that Frank had been poisoned by oleander. Investigators tried to speak with Angelina directly to have her repeat her oleander theory, but she pretended not to understand where they were going with it. However, through the sliding glass door of Angelina's house, the backyard was clearly visible. There stood a magnificent, blooming neighbor's bush that slightly overhung Angelina's property. It was a large, branching oleander with stunningly beautiful flowers, narrow, dark green leaves, and a deadly poison. While Frank's death remained a mystery, Angelina's detailed knowledge and then sudden amnesia about the oleander seemed suspicious. The forensic expert's report on oleander poisoning was expected to take some time, so the detectives spoke with Angelina's friends to learn more about her character. One of her longtime close friends was Palmyra Gorham. Palmyra revealed that, as close friends, they often joked in ways others might find inappropriate. Shortly after Angelina's marriage, she complained to Palmyra about being bored in the relationship. When Palmyra asked why she hadn't divorced her fourth husband like the previous three, Angelina replied, "He's insured, so it's worth putting up with. If I kill him, I'll get the money," she added. The friends then jokingly discussed how such a thing might be done and what poisoning methods they had heard of. Palmyra mentioned oleander, saying it could be mixed into tea because its bitter taste is easily masked. Angelina became very interested and fired Palmyra a dozen questions about oleander. At the time, Palmyra thought nothing of it. They were just joking. But Frank's sudden and unexplained death shook her confidence in that. Finally, the forensic expert's report arrived. It confirmed that oleander was indeed found in Frank's body, but not in a lethal amount. This left the investigators puzzled. Did this mean two types of poison were used? And how could they determine what the second one was? Since oleander was definitely present in Frank's system, the police focused their attention on Angelina. However, the detectives decided to withhold this information, even though it was difficult, as Angelina was constantly bombarding them with calls. There's nothing unusual about desperate calls from the victim's loved ones demanding justice. But Angie's daily calls had a different purpose. She didn't hide the fact that she wanted the insurance payout, and the investigators realized money was her main driving force. However, the insurance company explained that since Frank died within 2 years of the policy being taken out, they would first conduct their own investigation, and Angie wouldn't receive any money until the cause of death was determined. Angie likely didn't know this. So, if Frank was poisoned, could financial gain be the possible motive? The investigators decided to dig deeper to find out. The insurance agent told detectives that Angelina and Frank had purchased a $250,000 life insurance policy. Frank frankly didn't understand why they needed it. After all, they were already covered through his job in the National Guard. But Angelina was so insistent that the agent just leaned back in his chair and watched her do the convincing for him. The couple also agreed to take out a $50,000 policy on Angelina, but never followed through. The agent revealed that before sunrise the morning after Frank's death, Angelina called him, asking when she would receive the money. She bombarded him with calls, just like she did the police. She was in a rush to buy a house and wanted the agent to confirm to her realtor that the payout was imminent, but he refused. He simply couldn't be certain of anything yet. After speaking with the agent, the investigators were nearly certain Angelina believed she had committed the perfect murder. But maybe it was too perfect, and she was about to discover she wouldn't get a dime without a confirmed cause of death. Tests for various known poisons came back negative, leaving investigators desperate to figure out what toxin had been used. They started a cat-and-mouse game with Angelina, convincing her that the cause of death couldn't be confirmed without identifying the exact poison. She called almost every day, while they kept stalling, assuring her the coroner was still working. What else could she do? Surely she thought the police were clueless enough not to catch on if she didn't reveal the poison herself. In early October, Angelina called the detectives again with a fascinating story. She said an unknown man had contacted her from an untraceable number. The caller claimed to have great respect for her late husband and insisted he had something important to share. Allegedly, Chad Holloway told him the police wouldn't be able to pin the murder on him. Then the call started cutting out, and all Angelina could hear was, "Ask them about antifreeze." It sounded convincing, but Angie forgot one thing. The police could easily get phone records and verify that no anonymous calls were made to her. Still, the detectives got what they wanted. Antifreeze wasn't on the list of traditional poisons tested for during the autopsy, so the coroner started a special analysis. While waiting for the results, Angie kept trying to frame Chad. 2 anonymous letters demanding Chad's arrest arrived at the sheriff's office fax. At the end of January 2001, 4 months after Frank's sudden death, the medical examiner found ethylene glycol, a component of antifreeze, in the man's body. And thus the cause of death was antifreeze poisoning. In any other situation, it could have been assumed that the man ingested it accidentally. But considering all the gathered information and the amount of ethylene glycol in Frank's body, in addition to the oleander, the coroner concluded that the man had been murdered. The investigators also had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The only thing left was to prove it. They spoke once again with Angelina's relatives and friends. It turned out that once in the presence of Angelina, Palmira's boyfriend and mother had discussed antifreeze. They talked about how it's sweet and that, for example, children might drink it without suspecting anything, which is very dangerous. In other words, Angelina was told about two methods of poisoning, rare but effective. The police suspected that she first gave her husband a little oleander, which made him feel ill. But that wasn't enough to kill him, so she switched to antifreeze. The question was how to prove it. The detectives met with Chad again and asked for his help. They emphasized that they believed in his innocence and that Angelina was behind all his troubles, including the accusations of molesting minors. Chad readily agreed to assist. They outlined a rough script for the conversation, and he called Angelina. However, the call was short. Chad only managed to ask why she was accusing him of poisoning Frank with antifreeze. Angelina didn't respond, instead demanding to know how he got her number, saying she shouldn't be talking to him, and then hung up. Less than a minute later, Angelina contacted the detective, claiming Chad had called her and threatened her. According to her, Chad told her to keep quiet or she would regret it because they wouldn't be able to catch him anyway. The detective asked, "Did he threaten you?" And Angelina confirmed, "Yes, I'm scared to death." Of course, Chad never said any of that, as the police witnessed. Angelina was arrested and taken to jail to await trial for the murder of Frank Rodriguez. During a search of her home, officers found a napkin with the sheriff's fax number on it, meaning she could have been the sender of the anonymous letters the detectives had received. Additionally, officers found a piece of paper where the grieving widow had outlined how she planned to spend the insurance money. The officers also spoke with Autumn, Angelina's 9-year-old daughter. The girl had genuinely loved Frank as a father and was deeply grieving. She revealed that Frank had a personal bottle for his Gatorade sports drink. Angelina gave this bottle to Autumn and insisted that the girl make sure Frank drank every last drop. Moreover, the girl was strictly forbidden to take even a sip herself. Once in jail, Angelina believed that the only evidence the police had against her was Palmira's testimony. So Angie called her friend and warned her if she didn't change her statement, she would be arrested as an accomplice. Angelina even had a story ready for Palmira to tell the police in her defense. Supposedly, Palmira caught Angelina with her boyfriend and, out of revenge, made up the whole story about the poison. Palmira refused to cooperate, but Angelina didn't calm down. She believed that if her friend couldn't testify, that alone would be enough to plant doubt in the jurors' minds. In the neighboring cell was Gwendolyn Hall, whom Angelina considered a hardened criminal. Angelina decided that Gwendolyn would surely find a way to hire a hitman to kill Palmira, or Gwendolyn would do it herself. Angie promised first $20,000, then increased the offer to $30,000 for the job. In reality, Gwendolyn had no intention of looking for a killer. She chose to turn in the contractor. The police gave her a recorder, and sitting in the cell next to Angelina, she recorded every word. Angelina suggested staging the murder as a robbery gone wrong or framing Palmira's boyfriend. Thus, the police obtained proof that the accused tried to hire a hitman to kill Palmira. But there was a catch. Detectives didn't know if the contractor would stop there. What if Angelina hired someone else? And what if that person really did attack Palmira? Credit where it's due, the detectives came up with another brilliant plan to protect Palmira and help Angelina dig herself even deeper into trouble. They asked Palmira if she would agree to fake her own death. Palmira agreed, reasoning logically that it was better for the police to kill her in jest than for someone else to actually harm her. Using professional makeup, the detectives staged a murder scene and took a photo of the victim. Then, a police officer posing as the hitman met Angelina in prison and showed her the photo of Palmira lying on a bed with a bullet wound in her head. At first, Angelina was horrified and whispered that she was just joking. The detectives listened carefully, relieved, thinking that they had been wrong about her, that maybe she hadn't really planned to kill her friend. But then Angelina's lips curved into a wide, genuine smile and she said, "I'm going home. I'm ready to go home." 2 years after Frank's murder, his wife stood trial. The prosecution presented their theory that Angelina had started by adding oleander to her husband's tea and soups. But since the plant acted too slowly, she began to pour antifreeze into the Gatorade sports drink he consumed. On the witness stand was Palmira, who described how shortly before Frank's death, she had called Angelina and overheard a blender running in the background. Angelina said she was making a special milkshake for her husband. Palmira knew that Frank only drank it when he was unwell and asked if he was sick. Angelina replied, "Not yet." But if Angelina thought Palmira would be the prosecution's key witness, she hadn't counted on one more person. At the trial, Angelina's lover, Palmira's nephew Lauren Moranis, testified. He revealed that shortly before Frank's death, he had complained about being tired of secret meetings. Angelina assured him things would soon change. She had taken care of it. She confessed to him that she had deliberately damaged the gas line in the garage, hoping Frank would either be poisoned by gas or die in a house explosion. If Frank hadn't smelled the gas and called a technician, he could have died then and there. The technician concluded that someone had damaged the gas line in 2 places. Lauren explained he hadn't reported this earlier because he didn't want to get involved. Angelina was found guilty of murder for financial gain, but not guilty of solicitation to murder. However, this was not the worst surprise in the case. When it came time to determine the sentence, the prosecution demanded the death penalty and revealed that Frank's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. A few years ago, in 1992, Angelina, her second husband Tom, and their children, Otham and Alicia, traveled to Michigan to visit relatives and relax. They stopped at a restaurant for dinner, where a stranger approached them and, apologizing, mentioned that the company that manufactured baby pacifiers had received complaints about the model Alicia was using, as it could be dangerous. The woman clearly intended to warn the parents, but she inadvertently gave Angelina an idea. Angie took out a $50,000 insurance policy on her daughter, and just a few days later, Alicia died because of the pacifier. When emergency responders arrived, they were surprised to see Angelina waiting outside. From their experience, they knew a mother would never abandon a choking or suffocating child. Nonetheless, the child's death was ruled an accident. Angelina collected the insurance money and compensation from the manufacturer, totaling about $750,000. She received 60% of that amount, while Tom got the rest. The pacifiers were subsequently recalled. When Angie received the huge payout for Alicia's death, she realized that murder could be a very profitable business, especially if you could get away with it. However, upon closer examination of the evidence, detectives noticed that the pacifier had been pulled and torn with some kind of tool. The child could not have done this herself. An expert declared that the only way Alicia could have died was if the pacifier was broken and deliberately pushed down her throat. She was definitely murdered. But after all these years, detectives and prosecutors could not charge Angelina with murder. Although the case did not proceed, the cause of Alicia's death was officially changed from an accident to homicide. On January 12, 2004, Angelina was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the 19th woman sentenced to death in California. However, California has a moratorium on the death penalty, so she will remain in prison for the rest of her life. Angelina committed an almost perfect murder. The police would never have discovered the poison that killed Frank, and his wife might have walked away free. But in order to receive the insurance payout, she had to reveal the case for the police. She succeeded in doing that and led investigators to the real killer. By killing her husband, she wanted the insurance money to buy a house, but ended up locked in a solitary death row cell with no money at all. Headaches were frequent visitors in the home of Susan Snow from Auburn, Washington. By now, they no longer surprised her, nor did they seriously worry the 40-year-old. Susan worked as an assistant to the vice president at Puget Sound National Bank. Over the years, many clients had gotten to know her personally, respected her for her professionalism and kindness, and often requested that only she handle their accounts. But her success and popularity didn't ease the stress and pressure that came with the job. The headaches came often, though not badly enough to justify taking sick leave. Instead, Susan simply took a few tablets of over-the-counter Excedrin Extra Strength. Susan felt yet another annoying headache as she woke up on the morning of June 11, 1986. Shaking a couple of red gelatin-coated capsules out of the bottle, she swallowed them and placed the bottle back into the cabinet above the kitchen sink. The powerful medication usually eased her headaches within 15 minutes. In the meantime, she could wash up and change into her business suit. Susan's 15-year-old daughter, Haley, was also up and taking a shower before school. That morning, only Susan and Haley were at home. Susan's husband, 45-year-old Paul Webb King, was a long-haul truck driver and had already left for work. Her older daughter, 23-year-old Exer, had spent the night in the city. Haley could hear the muffled sound of running water through the bathroom wall. It was coming from her mother's room, where Susan was finishing getting ready for work. Suddenly, Haley flinched at the sound of a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. She figured her mom might have tripped and fallen, Listening closely but hearing nothing else, she shrugged it off, assuming she was overreacting and that maybe a heavy bottle or something similar had simply dropped. After her shower, Haley was putting on makeup in front of the mirror when she realized the water was still running. Something felt wrong. She walked into her mother and stepfather's bedroom, but Susan wasn't there. The sound of rushing water still came from the bathroom. Haley called out to her mom. No answer. She peeked inside. The sink was nearly overflowing. Any more and water would have started spilling onto the floor. Susan couldn't turn it off. She was lying on her back at the base of the sink, her head awkwardly propped against the frame of the shower stall. Her eyes were wide open, fixed in place. Her skin looked unnaturally pale and tense, her face frozen in a mask of terror. She was gasping for air, like she was suffocating. Haley had never seen her mother like this. Panicked, she rushed over and tried to lift her, but Susan didn't respond. At 6:43 a.m., Haley called emergency services, and by 7 o'clock, paramedics had already arrived at the house. She assumed her mother had fallen. The medical team also initially believed Susan had hit her head, but there were no visible injuries. No cuts, bruises, swelling, or fractures. A curling iron lay near the sink, which Susan had been using, but electrocution seemed unlikely. There were no burn marks, and a shock strong enough to cause this kind of collapse would have tripped the circuit. The paramedics began checking medication bottles for signs of overdose, accidental or otherwise. But Haley was quick to explain that her mother wasn't depressed and would never harm herself. She didn't use illegal substances either. Haley mentioned that her mother had woken up with one of her usual headaches and had taken some painkillers. She brought the bottle of Excedrin from the kitchen. It contained 60 capsules originally, and only a few were missing. Susan couldn't have taken too many, and given how often she used the medication, a bad reaction seemed unlikely. With no clear understanding of what was wrong, the doctors did everything they could to help Susan, but her breathing grew more labored and her pulse weakened rapidly. A helicopter was dispatched to airlift her to a medical center. Since Susan had no history of serious health issues, doctors suspected her recurring headaches might have been signs of an undiagnosed condition, like a stroke or an aneurysm. However, none of her symptoms fully aligned with any known diagnosis. The medical team was confused and unsure how to treat her. Meanwhile, Susan's condition was deteriorating by the second. Her loved ones, husband Paul, her second ex-husband Connie Snow, with whom she remained on friendly terms, her twin sister Sarah, and her older daughter Exer, were all notified of Susan's hospitalization. At first, none of them were overly concerned. Susan had always seemed healthy and rarely complained about her well-being, so the idea of something serious didn't cross their minds. But as they arrived at the hospital one by one, they were horrified by what they saw. Susan had slipped into a coma, and machines were the only thing keeping her alive. Doctors confirmed brain death and delivered the heartbreaking news that there was no hope for recovery. By midday, Susan Snow was gone, a seemingly healthy woman taken in a matter of hours by an unknown force. What exactly caused Susan's sudden death remained a medical mystery. Hoping for answers, her family agreed to an autopsy. At the morgue, as the pathologist made the first incision to open the chest cavity, her assistant caught a distinct smell rising from the body, the bitter scent of almonds. The assistant immediately recognized it as the telltale sign of cyanide poisoning and reported it to the pathologist. However, the pathologist couldn't detect the scent. Soon after, Susan's attending physician entered the room, also eager to learn the cause of death, and he didn't smell it either. In addition, Susan's skin was unusually pale. While cyanide victims typically show pink or bright red coloring, the assistant hesitated to press the issue, but insisted the pathologist send a blood sample for cyanide testing, a procedure not normally done during a standard autopsy. The medical examiner agreed, though she remained convinced Susan had died from natural causes, possibly cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that, in severe cases, can cause stroke or heart failure. But to everyone's astonishment, cyanide was found in Susan's system. The pathologist and doctor hadn't noticed it because the ability to detect the smell of cyanide is genetic. 20 to 40% of people simply lack the gene required to sense it. Had the assistant not been present during the autopsy, the cyanide that killed Susan likely would have gone undetected. In fact, her symptoms aligned perfectly with cyanide poisoning. The toxin prevents cells from absorbing oxygen, effectively suffocating the body from within. Deprived of oxygen, cells quickly begin to die, leading to dizziness, shortness of breath, coma, and, in lethal doses, cardiac arrest. Susan's fall, labored breathing, and rapid decline into unconsciousness all fit this pattern. The only anomaly was her pale skin. Cyanide victims often appear pink or red, but this isn't always the case. The pathologist informed Susan's family and the police. The cause of death was acute cyanide poisoning. It's a rare form of poisoning, most often caused by inhaling smoke during house or industrial fires. Cyanide is also found in metalwork, jewelry production, photography, pest control, and agriculture. None of these applied to Susan, nor could she have accidentally ingested a fatal amount. While trace amounts exist in certain seeds or fruits, an adult would have to consume hundreds, if not thousands, for it to be lethal. Intentional ingestion was also unlikely. Her family firmly denied any signs of depression, and Susan had clearly been preparing for a regular workday. In cases of suicide by cyanide, it's usually committed by people with lab or medical access. Susan wasn't one of them. Police arrived at her home and seized anything that could possibly contain cyanide, pesticides, chemicals, and especially the bottle of Excedrin capsules. Detectives still remembered the horror of the Chicago Tylenol murders 4 years earlier, when an unknown pharmaceutical terrorist laced capsules with cyanide, killing 7. By that evening, tests on Susan's Excedrin were complete. Of the original 60 capsules, 56 remained. 9 of them contained 4 times the lethal dose of cyanide. There were no fingerprints on the pills, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual, Susan's husband, Paul Webb King, had suspected the Excedrin long before anyone else. During the autopsy, Paul had a phone conversation with the pathologist. They discussed various possible causes of death, all of which Paul dismissed. Then, almost out of nowhere, he asked whether his wife could have died from poisoned capsules. The question caught the doctor off guard. Paul explained that Susan had taken Excedrin right before her collapse, specifically from a newly opened bottle of capsules. At the time, the pathologist brushed the idea aside, thinking it was far-fetched. But once cyanide was actually discovered in the capsules, Paul's oddly specific suspicion raised red flags. Paul claimed that earlier that morning, before leaving for work, he too had taken a dose from the same bottle to ease his arthritis symptoms. No one had witnessed this, and there were just enough missing capsules to suggest he might have taken some, or that he simply removed a few to support his story. Had Paul been unbelievably lucky to avoid death, or had he known the pills were poisoned? Detectives began to suspect the latter. Further doubts came from Susan's identical twin sister, Sarah. Like Susan, she suffered from frequent headaches, and both sisters preferred buying their painkillers in tablet form, not capsules. After the infamous Tylenol murders in Chicago, they believed tablets were harder to tamper with. So when Sarah saw a bottle of capsule form Excedrin in her sister's home, she was shocked. She brought it up to Paul. He claimed Susan had accidentally bought capsules instead of tablets, but later discovered she preferred them. They were easier to swallow. Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about his explanation didn't sit right. Taking these facts into account, it's no surprise that the detectives began to look at Paul as a suspect, especially since the search for other possible suspects, such as the bank's clients, Susan's ex-husbands, or lovers, yielded no results. The investigators themselves noted that Paul's character lacked positive traits, and he spoke about his late wife without emotion. He made crude jokes that made others feel uncomfortable given the situation. The only time he showed any emotion was when his face flushed with anger upon realizing he was being considered a suspect. Those who knew him described him as a jealous, possessive man who only cared that his wife earned more than he did. When Paul was asked about the marriage, he said that he and his wife got along perfectly and hadn't argued since September 1985. He remembered the date precisely because that was when he confessed to being unfaithful. During a business trip, he had an affair with an ex-girlfriend named Mary. Paul claimed that after seeing a psychologist, he and Sue reconciled, and in the following months surprised everyone by announcing their engagement. They exchanged vows on Thanksgiving Day, 1985, about 7 months before Sue's death. But although Paul insisted they were getting along well, others might dispute that claim. The husband's infidelity was all Susan talked about. She kept a photo of Mary in a kitchen cabinet and even once showed the picture to her younger daughter saying, "Look at this bitch." In her notebook she wrote, "To hell with Paul. I hate Mary. I hate Paul." She thought about kicking her husband out, but couldn't bring herself to do it. The thought of losing him devastated her. It was the late Susan who was the glue holding the family together. With her gone, the family split into 2 factions. On one side was Paul, on the other were everyone else. From a practical standpoint, Paul wasn't the only one who could have administered the poison. As Paul rightly told Haley, she should prepare herself because she was alone with her mother at the time of death and would become the prime suspect. But it wasn't only Haley who was scared. The older daughter, Exeter, was also in town and even stopped by her mother's house the evening before her death to pick up some things. She did not stay overnight at her mother's house, but stayed at a hotel with a friend Susan couldn't stand. Right after her mother's death, Exeter gave a statement, but when asked to come to the station a second time, she showed up with a lawyer, then left after a minute and refused to speak to the police. The detectives understood that every member of Susan's family had the opportunity to poison her. They all had access to the house and no one would have aroused suspicion being in the kitchen, but only one person stood to gain financially from Sue's death. She was insured for $20,000, which Paul would have received. The man claimed he would use part of the sum to pay off credit card bills, with the remainder going to Sue's daughters. However, the girls didn't receive a single cent. When they asked him about the promised money, he replied that finances were tight. The daughters also noticed that their mother's jewelry had gone missing. Paul himself was changing before their eyes. He swapped his usual Hawaiian shirts for expensive business attire and bought a new car. He also started seeing another woman. It was as if he didn't care that his behavior was making him look more and more suspicious. Meanwhile, news about the poison capsules, of course, reached Bristol Myers Squibb, the manufacturer of Excedrin, and rumors began circulating about a copycat poisoner from Chicago. However, the police were convinced that Susan's murder was an isolated incident committed by someone she knew. Nevertheless, unwilling to take any chances, Bristol Myers recalled the capsule products nationwide. This decision cost them millions, possibly tens of millions of dollars. The product recall became sensational news. The media loudly covered Susan's murder. Customers returned Excedrin to pharmacies, and staff removed it from the shelves. All the bottles were sent for laboratory analysis, despite the police's confidence that this was a waste of time. But everything changed on June 17th when the police received a call. The woman on the line was hysterical. She spoke incoherently but managed to explain that she noticed similarities between Susan's murder, which had been in the news, and the death of her husband a week earlier. 6 days before Sue's death, on June 5, 1986, 52-year-old Bruce Nickel returned home from his job at the State Department of Transportation, where he worked as a heavy equipment operator. He arrived at 4:10 p.m. His beloved wife, 43-year-old Stella, was preparing dinner. Due to working with heavy equipment, Bruce often suffered from headaches. This day was no exception. He hoped a shower would refresh him, but the headache wouldn't simply go away, so he resorted to his usual remedy, a strong dose of Excedrin. The recommended dose was 2 capsules, but Bruce decided the medicine would work faster and be more effective if he took 4. All he had to do now was wait. Bruce went out to the backyard, where he breathed in the fresh air and admired the peaceful surroundings. After a few minutes, Stella was startled when her husband called out to her in a strange way. She found Bruce leaning against the patio doorframe. He was dizzy and on the verge of fainting. Stella helped him to the couch. Bruce tried to sit, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor. At 5:02 p.m., Stella called emergency services and reported that her husband was having some kind of seizure. Paramedics found Bruce lying on the living room floor, unresponsive. He was gasping for air. What also disturbed the medics was the color of his skin. His body was pale, except for his head, where the skin had turned bright red. They had never seen anything like it and didn't know what it meant. While the medics attempted to revive Bruce, Stella explained that her husband was a recovering alcoholic and a heavy smoker. But considering this, he was generally quite healthy. He was not prone to anxiety attacks, fainting, or seizures. From time to time, he experienced headaches, including the one he had that day. Stella brought the painkiller package from the kitchen. The medics quickly examined it and ruled out the medicine as the cause of Bruce's condition. It was just Excedrin, which Bruce regularly took without problems. Time was critical. The man's blood pressure was dropping, and efforts to stabilize him failed. A helicopter transported him to the medical center, but despite the doctor's efforts, he died by midnight. Bruce Nickel was an adopted child. At 16, he accidentally overheard a conversation and learned the truth. Although he loved his adoptive parents deeply and was endlessly grateful to them, he was haunted by the thought that his biological mother had abandoned him. This led to trust issues that contributed to 3 failed marriages, as well as a serious alcohol addiction, which he used to numb his pain. At the same time, he was a very intelligent man, gentle, sensitive, and with a great sense of humor. But by the time he was well into his 40s, he was still hopping from bar to bar until he either passed out or got thrown out, whichever happened first. One evening at a tavern, he met an elegant, dark-haired beauty he had never seen before in town. Her name was Stella, and she didn't seem like the kind of woman someone like Bruce would attract. However, Like Bruce, Stella carried her own scars, both emotional and physical. Stella was born in Oregon but remembered little of her childhood because one time her father, drunk again, kicked her mother, brothers, and sisters out of the house, shooting at them with a shotgun. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but that was the last straw for Stella's mother. She took the children and moved to Colorado. Then came two terrible fires. After the first, Stella needed a skin graft. The second fire resulted in the death of her little brother. At 15, Stella realized she was pregnant and confessed to her family that it was the result of abuse. On October 23, 1959, she gave birth to a girl, Cindy. Another pregnancy came when Stella was 18, but she gave that child up for adoption. She often changed relationships, homes, and jobs. Over the years, Stella built an emotional armor around herself. Those who weren't close to her found her cold, distant, and withdrawn. But those who managed to break through found warmth, humor, and passion. Her first meeting with Bruce left little impression on Stella, but a week later she ran into him on the street and saw him in a different light. He seemed smart and attractive to her. Even his alcoholism didn't repel her. She accepted it. Strange as it may sound, their romance blossomed in bars, where they spent evenings playing pool and drinking. Every weekend they enjoyed wild parties. They got married in September 1976, but within a year they faced financial difficulties, largely due to Bruce's habit of spending $250 a week on alcohol, a significant amount even by today's standards. Although they both enjoyed their alcohol-fueled lifestyle, Stella encouraged her husband to cut back on drinking, or at least drink at home, which would be safer and cheaper. But Bruce found it hard to change until one moment. In 1979, he went on a 2-week binge, missing work and rarely coming home. When Stella found him in a bar, something seemed to click in his mind. He enrolled in an addiction treatment program. Over 10 days, he underwent aversion therapy, commonly known as coding, completed the program on the 10th day, and from that moment on, Bruce never took another sip of alcohol. However, Bruce couldn't give up another bad habit. He was a heavy smoker. During the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that the man died of hypertension due to cardiopulmonary collapse caused by emphysema of the lungs. But his wife simply couldn't accept this. Her husband was healthy. Bruce had recently undergone a medical exam for work. The doctors had warned that he might develop emphysema in the future, but they had seen no signs of it at the time. Stella wondered if a lung disease could progress so quickly and fatally. Nevertheless, from a medical standpoint, the case was closed. Bruce was buried. And a week later, Susan Snow's murder made headlines everywhere. After Stella's call to the police, an officer arrived at her home. Stella opened the door. The widowed woman looked absolutely terrible. Stella had become seriously addicted to alcohol. Friends worried she would drink herself to death. Her house had turned into a dump. Even her once bright and colorful tropical fish aquariums, a source of pride, showed signs of neglect. Stella worked as a security inspector at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She monitored X-ray machines, checking travelers' luggage before flights. She had risen to a supervisory position due to the seriousness with which she approached her job, but since her husband's death, she spent nights in bars and showed up to work in the morning, smelling strongly of alcohol. At the officer's request, Stella brought the medication Bruce had taken before his death. The bottle was almost empty, only 8 capsules remained. Stella also handed over a second bottle, still sealed in its packaging. She had purchased them at different locations about 2 weeks apart. Stella believed she bought the first bottle somewhere in Auburn and the second in Kent. Both bottles were sent for testing. Poison capsules were found in both bottles of Excedrin from the family's home. Bruce had already been buried, but a vial of his blood, taken during the autopsy, was kept at the King County Medical Examiner's office. When the police requested it be analyzed, poison was detected. Bruce had died from cyanide poisoning, so 2 people had died from acute cyanide poisoning. Yet Bruce and Susan were strangers to each other. They had nothing in common except that they both lived in Auburn, Washington. The news of the second poisoning spread fear. Investigators once again shifted the focus of the investigation. This time they were searching for a serial killer. At that point, only 2 victims were known, but the police feared there might be more. The product recall continued, and Bristol-Myers faced immeasurable damage. Paul Webb King and Stella Nickel filed lawsuits against the company. Paul expressed frustration with how the police were handling the investigation. He felt the investigators were wasting time on him when they should be looking for the real killer. Surprisingly, 3 of Paul's ex-wives came to his defense. They insisted he was not a wife killer, just someone who divorced if something in the relationship stopped working for him. Finally, when Paul passed a polygraph test, meanwhile, Bristol-Myers recalled 15,000 packages of Excedrin. And out of those 15,000, only one contained cyanide. The bottle was taken from the same store in Kent where Stella Nickel had bought the medication. After examining Bristol-Myers manufacturing facilities, the police concluded that cyanide could not have entered the capsules during production. Moreover, the poisoned bottles had only appeared so far in King County, Washington. Investigators narrowed their search to the store in Kent, questioning staff about disgruntled former employees or customers acting suspiciously. Then, on June 24th, another extraordinary event occurred. A bottle of maximum-strength Anisin 3, placed on top of a jar of peanuts 2 rows away from the medicine aisle, was out of place. Given the circumstances in the city, the manager handed the medication over to the FBI, and it was found that 4 capsules contained cyanide instead of painkillers. This confirmed that the poisoner was active in King County, not at the manufacturing sites of either drug. The situation was unprecedented. Washington state imposed a 90-day ban on the sale of all over-the-counter capsule medications. Pharmaceutical companies affected by the ban united and offered a $300,000 reward for the capture of the poisoner. All the bottles were sent to the FBI for analysis. No fingerprints were found on any of the capsules. The perpetrator had likely thought to wear gloves. The poisoner carefully opened the packaging along the seam and cut the safety seal around the neck of the bottle. The medicinal contents of the capsules were discarded, and instead, each capsule contained 700 milligrams of cyanide. The bottles were then placed back into their packaging, which was resealed to make it appear unopened. This was noticeable in principle, but not obvious to an unsuspecting buyer. However, the white cyanide powder was mixed with tiny green crystals. The crystals turned out to be an algicide, a substance used to destroy algae in water bodies. The product was called Algae Destroyer. These were tablets that dissolved when placed in water. An FBI agent visited several pet stores in King County, showing the staff photos of people connected to Bruce and Susan. At one store, he came across a manager who confirmed that they sold such a product, but not very often. The issue was that moisture seeped into the packaging with the tablets, causing them to harden and barely dissolve in water. Therefore, the pet store usually ordered liquid algicides. However, there was one regular customer who disliked the liquid algicide, so the store kept a stock of the tablets specifically for her. The store manager pointed to the photo of the customer, a woman with long, wavy hair. He couldn't recall her name, but knew she shopped there frequently, sometimes every week. She kept several aquariums with tropical fish at home and even shared with him her dream of someday opening her own tropical fish store. The photo he pointed to was of Stella Nickel. It turned out that Stella had crushed the cyanide salts in the same bowl or mortar where she ground the algicide tablets before throwing them into the aquarium. But if that was true, she had already gotten away with murder thanks to the initial findings of the medical examiner. The case had been closed. All she had to do now was play the role of a grieving widow and stay silent. So why call the police a week later and attract attention to herself? The answer lay in one clause of Bruce's insurance policy, which investigators nearly missed. In the event of natural death, Stella would receive about $30,000. But if he died as a result of an accident, she would get another $100,000. Death from emphysema didn't suit the greedy wife at all. So when the media started reporting about the cyanide poisoning of Susan Snow a week later, Stella hurried to claim that her husband had died under similar circumstances. Bruce had signed his accident insurance policy just 6 months before his death. However, an FBI handwriting expert concluded that it was not Bruce who signed the document, but his wife. It was easy to believe because back in 1971, Stella had already gotten into trouble for forging documents. Her cousin was supposed to stay at Stella's house for a while, so Stella gave her own address to receive benefits. However, the cousin and her husband changed their plans and moved to Texas, where the husband found a job. They told Stella that the benefits would stop, but the money kept coming. Bob, Stella's ex-husband, asked her to send the money back. Instead, she found someone to forge her sister's husband's signature and started regularly receiving $119.50. The fraud was uncovered 9 months later when her cousin visited. Stella was sentenced to 6 months in prison but was released after 4 months for good behavior. Unfortunately for her, during that time, Bob started seeing a neighbor and was ready to divorce. Furious that she was so quickly replaced, Stella began blaming her husband for everything. She claimed that the document forgery was his idea and accused him of abusing her older daughter Cindy and their mutual daughter Leah, which was, of course, untrue. When Bob mentioned that he liked the curls of the daughter, Stella cut off all of Leah's hair. She even tried to flee the state with the girls. In the end, Bob gained custody of Leah and took her away. Cindy, Stella's eldest daughter, was still a teenager at the time, but Bob couldn't take her because he was not her father. So the detectives understood that Stella had no problem with fraud and was probably not a perfect mother, but that would not help prove her guilt in the murder. The search of her home and work locker yielded nothing. Among her aquarium supplies, there wasn't even any algicide. The detectives insisted that she take a lie detector test. Reluctantly, she agreed. While the polygraph test did a great favor to Paul, Susan's husband, by clearing him as a suspect, Stella was much less fortunate. The polygraph indicated that Stella was lying. The test results were not considered evidence, so she was released home. However, the news of her failed lie detector test triggered an interesting reaction. The FBI was contacted by Cindy, Stella's 26-year-old eldest daughter. The relationship between mother and daughter teetered on the edge between love and hate. Stella was a strict mother and demanded tough discipline. In 1969, she was arrested for beating her 10-year-old daughter. Soon after, the girl left her mother's home, and in 1978, 19-year-old Cindy found out she was pregnant. But her hope that the child would bring her closer to her mother faded when Stella responded to the news with, "I'm not ready to be a grandmother." However, when Cindy needed a job, her mother rushed to help and got her hired at the same airport where she worked. Some time ago, Stella began bringing up strange topics in conversation. For example, she asked how much of a forbidden substance would cause an overdose, or wondered why people hire hitmen if they could just arrange for brake failure or a car accident instead. At first, she spoke hypothetically, but soon she slipped and revealed that Bruce was the intended victim in all her scenarios. Cindy knew that her mother's family was struggling with debt and had recently received the final notice about overdue mortgage payments. She also knew how Stella regretted that her husband had stopped drinking. Suddenly, things became boring. The couple could no longer have fun together. Bruce had become a homebody, spending evenings in front of the TV, yet he turned out to be very strong-willed. No matter how much Stella tempted him, he resisted and did not return to his unhealthy habit. Cindy believed her mother was not serious and that if necessary, she would simply divorce Bruce. But when the truth about his poisoning and Stella's failed polygraph test came out, Cindy contacted the FBI. She revealed shocking details to the agents. Her mother had approached the matter seriously, visiting the library to first research poisonous plants. In particular, she became interested in foxglove, a pretty but poisonous plant that could be easily found right near the Nickel family home. 6 months before Bruce's death, Stella collected foxglove seeds and added them to a capsule she gave her husband. The plan was clever. Bruce liked to occasionally chew on plants growing near the house. If he had been poisoned this way, everyone would have thought he ate something on his own. But Bruce complained to colleagues about stomach pain and weakness, then quickly recovered. Stella was upset that her plan had failed. The detectives hurried to the library and seized the books Stella had borrowed. Among them was a book with a telling title, Deadly Harvest, an encyclopedia of poisonous plants. She had also read about other poisons, especially cyanide. The police established this thanks to her fingerprints found all over the pages. These pieces of evidence, along with Cindy's testimony, were enough to press charges of product tampering, including 2 cases that led to death. The trial began in April 1988. Cindy became the key witness for the prosecution. She testified that she and her mother shared a locker at work. A few days before her stepfather's death, Cindy saw capsules in a container with white powder in the locker. She thought it was salt or sugar, but her mother never used it for food. After the man's death, both the container and capsules disappeared. Stella continued to deny everything. She claimed she read the books to learn about poisonous plants because she often babysat her granddaughter. She insisted her daughter had simply lied, motivated by the $300,000 reward offered by pharmaceutical companies. While she might have been partly right about Cindy's motive, it did not diminish the importance of her testimony. Cindy might have saved her stepfather's life if she had warned him or acted sooner. But now her testimony allowed investigators to connect all the events into a single story. After her husband's death, Stella faced an unpleasant surprise when the pathologist ruled Bruce's death natural. She couldn't directly tell him to keep looking for the cause. So she decided to recreate the infamous Chicago tragedy, planting bottles with poison in various stores like some sort of pharmaceutical terrorist, and waited. After Susan Snow's death, Stella had a reason to request a review of her husband's case. If Stella's motive had been to kill her husband, she would have committed the perfect crime. But her real motive was money, and she drew attention to herself. Her plan unraveled due to mistakes she made along the way. She confessed everything to her daughter, researched poisons in the library, and crushed cyanide in the same mortar as the algae treatment. But her biggest blunder was poisoning both bottles of Excedrin that she kept at home. Out of 15,000 recalled Excedrin packages, only 4 were found to contain poison, and Stella supposedly managed to buy 2 of them from different stores 2 weeks apart. The odds of that were negligible, and this was the final nail in her coffin. After 5 days of deliberation, on May 9th, the jury found Stella guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive 90-year terms for product tampering that led to death, and 3 10-year terms for other tampering offenses. If she is not released early, she will be freed in 2040 at the age of 96. Investigators knew how lucky they were that cyanide was discovered during Susan's autopsy, which led to the product recall. Many more people could have died otherwise. Stella would have had no choice but to keep killing again and again, waiting for another victim, and then another. She would have continued playing the role of the grieving widow, all the while knowing that the remaining bottles of poison sat on store shelves, waiting to take the life of yet another innocent victim.
When Brigida Uto arrived at the emergency department, she was on the brink of death. While her vital signs were rapidly deteriorating, doctors couldn't find any signs of injury or infection. Medical professionals, FBI agents, and the police all came together to solve not only the medical mystery but also to uncover the horrifyingly inventive crime. On March 5, 2018, the medical staff at a hospital in San Diego, California, was awaiting the arrival of a 28-year-old patient named Brigida. She was being transported by an ambulance from her family doctor's office. On that day, Brigida called her mother, Olga, complaining of feeling unwell. Olga struggled to get her into the car. Brigida could barely breathe, and her legs trembled with excruciating pain. With just one look at the once vibrant and healthy young woman, the family doctor knew that Brigida was in critical condition and there was nothing he could do for her. Therefore, he called an ambulance to take her to the clinic. The emergency department medics were also alarmed that they might not be able to stabilize the patient's condition. Brigida was in unbearable pain, could hardly see anything, could barely speak, and had no sensation in her feet or hands. But the most puzzling symptom was that her once beautiful chestnut hair was falling out in clumps. The doctors began their work. They quickly determined that there were no external signs of trauma on her body. No bruises, wounds, or indications of infection. The cause of her illness was internal. Brigida's mother explained that her daughter had been suffering from sudden episodes of nausea, fatigue, and excruciating pain for several months. The symptoms would occur suddenly without any warning, causing her to spend days in bed. Brigida could barely take care of herself, let alone her husband and young son. Various specialists she consulted were at a loss, unable to understand what was afflicting her. Her symptoms did not match any known illness. One doctor even told her that her case was how critical days manifest. Finally, the doctors concluded that it was a result of stress and prescribed her tranquilizers. However, her condition worsened, her body was failing, and the medical staff in the emergency department of San Diego understood that if they didn't figure out what was wrong with her as soon as possible, the patient could die within days. Brigida grew up in California, just a few kilometers away from the border with Mexico. Her father worked at the customs between Mexico and the United States, while her mother took care of their 2 daughters, Brigida and her younger sister Olga. The girls grew up in a loving and caring family. Brigida happily attended a Catholic school, excelling in her studies. Her friends described her as the friendliest and kindest girl they knew. Brigida had a passion for running and even participated in competitions, representing her school. It was through running that she met her future husband, Race Remington Uto. They met in high school. Race attended a different school but was also passionate about sports. At first, Brigida's family didn't pay much attention to their friendship because their daughter wasn't interested in dating boys. Her time was consumed by studying and sports. However, gradually, the young couple became more and more involved with each other and started dating. Race managed to bring out a more adventurous side of Brigida, and soon they became inseparable. Race had a highly ambitious goal. He dreamt of attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The acceptance rate for students was less than 8%, making it a challenging task. The applicant had to excel in school, work on personal development, engage in sports, participate in community life, engage in volunteer work, and much more. Surprisingly, Race managed to gain admission to the academy, and he moved to Maryland to begin his education. The young couple continued their relationship long distance. However, after some time, Race was diagnosed with a hernia that didn't resolve completely. He had to leave the academy but found work as an electrician in the Navy. Meanwhile, Brigida pursued her own plans and became a teacher. In 2014, after 7 years of being together, 25-year-old Brigida and 24-year-old Race got married. Soon after, they welcomed their son. Brigida believed she was perfectly happy, with everything in her life going according to plan. She had a loving, caring husband, a wonderful child, and lived just steps away from her parents. However, her life would soon take an extraordinary and painful turn that she could never have imagined. Among the emergency department physicians at San Diego Hospital, there was a certified toxicologist named Dr. Jeff LaPointe, which was considered rare. He was a true medical detective, and like an excellent detective, LaPointe followed the trail of clues that could lead him to understand what was happening to Bridget. Was she being killed by an autoimmune disease? No, blood tests did not confirm that. Could she be suffering from cancer? No, although one symptom stood out among all others: hair loss was not due to the disease but rather a result of therapy. All the symptoms indicated that Bridget had been exposed to a toxic chemical. But which one, and how? Was it arsenic, cadmium, or cesium? No, because these heavy metals wouldn't result in hair loss. However, there was one substance that could: thallium. In the early 20th century, thallium was used as a depilatory agent. It was also actively utilized by doctors. For example, if a child had head lice, thallium was applied to their head, causing the lice to fall off along with all the hair. In subsequent years, thallium became the main component of rodent poisons. However, by the 1970s, its popularity as a murder weapon, alongside arsenic, had increased to the point where it was banned for sale and use. All of Bridget's symptoms, including leg pain, weakness, deteriorating vision, loss of appetite, weight loss, and, of course, hair loss, indicated thallium poisoning. The problem was that Dr. LaPointe couldn't confirm his suspicions quickly. Nobody in the hospital had encountered such a case before, and there was no way to test the patient for poisoning. The samples had to be sent to another laboratory, and the results would be available in 3 days. 3 days that Bridget might not have. The race against time had begun. LaPointe started calling all the agencies, requesting an expedited analysis. But even if the doctor's suspicions proved to be correct and Bridget was suffering from thallium poisoning, the antidote would be urgently needed. However, obtaining the antidote, poetically named Berlin Blue, turned out to be more challenging than he could ever imagine. We have all seen Berlin Blue because it is a blue pigment used in paints. Vincent van Gogh used it when painting Starry Night over the Rhone. This substance is also an antidote for poisoning by certain heavy metals, accelerating their elimination from the body. However, while you can buy blue paint at the nearest art supply store, obtaining medical-grade Berlin Blue is almost unrealistic. LaPointe called all the pharmacies, naval medical officers, clinics, but he found the antidote only at one warehouse, a classified warehouse in Los Angeles. The thing is, Berlin Blue is also an antidote for radiation exposure, such as in the case of a dirty bomb explosion. Therefore, the government keeps meticulous records of every tube of Berlin Blue in the country. And Dr. Lapointe couldn't count on getting the antidote until thallium poisoning was confirmed in the laboratory. When the toxicological analysis of Bridget's case arrived, Lapointe's worst fears were confirmed. The level of thallium in Bridget's body exceeded the permissible limit by 1,000 times. A hospital staff member drove all night to bring the antidote to San Diego. However, the doctor feared that with such a severe poisoning, one antidote might not be sufficient. He prescribed dialysis for the patient to cleanse her blood. It was a slow and painful process, and now all the medical staff and Bridget's family could do was wait and pray. Meanwhile, Bridget's husband and son were placed in another wing of the hospital to monitor their health. If she had been exposed to thallium, they could have been affected too. The main question remained, where could she have obtained such a large quantity of thallium? And the answer to that was being sought by FBI agents. It should be understood that all this was happening in a state with several military bases. Furthermore, these events unfolded against the backdrop of President Trump's planned visit. Therefore, when Dr. Lapointe started looking for Berlin Blue, the FBI agents became very interested in what was happening in the city. FBI agents and police have discovered that several months ago, Bridget underwent treatment at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico, when she began experiencing an unexplained illness. The police investigated this lead but ultimately dismissed it. The school where Bridget taught was a former military base during World War II, where rodent poisoning could have occurred in the past. In that year, many teachers at the school fell ill. However, this lead also turned out to be a dead end. Investigators could not dismiss the possibility that Bridget had used thallium herself as a cry for attention due to her depression. But everyone who knew her claimed that she loved life and would never abandon her son. Furthermore, her depression emerged after the appearance of unexplained symptoms, not the other way around. Dr. Lapointe had his own suspicions about how his patient had been poisoned. He conducted a scan of Bridget's internal organs and was horrified to discover numerous white spots throughout her digestive tract. It became evident that the poison was entering her body through food. Someone close to her had attempted the perfect crime. Dr. Lapointe ordered complete isolation for the patient, allowing no one to visit her or provide her with food except what was provided by the hospital. However, at that moment, food was the least of her concerns. Bridget regained consciousness thanks to the antidote after a few days. All her hair had fallen out, and she couldn't sit or move, but she was alive. She couldn't name anyone who would wish her harm. However, the police knew that poisoning is always a personal crime committed by a close friend or family member. It was also interesting that Bridget's husband and child were unharmed. The police spoke with her sister, parents, and husband, all of whom were eager to help with the investigation. Ray wept and lamented that he couldn't switch places with his wife to relieve her suffering. He said what the detectives wanted to hear, yet investigators sensed falsehood in his words. The medical staff also noted that he didn't seem as concerned and asked strange and sometimes inappropriate questions. Response to the suspicion regarding her husband's involvement, Bridget became angered and vehemently denied it. She insisted that Ray had been caring for her when she was unwell, taking care of their son and bringing her to the hospital. Furthermore, he would prepare meals when she lacked the strength to get out of bed. However, during the conversation with Bridget, the investigators learned something that sent chills down their spines. Ray had a rather unusual hobby. He enjoyed collecting rare seeds of poisonous plants. This piqued the police's interest, and after 16 days of Bridget's hospitalization, the police gathered enough evidence to search their home. Ray opened the door and appeared somewhat agitated. The detectives asked him to hand over all the family's gadgets, and he willingly surrendered all the phones and laptops. However, he couldn't help but notice that all the search histories on the devices had recently been cleared. Despite the supposedly deleted data on his phone, the police found 2 books in Ray's mobile: Criminal Poisoning and The Poisoner's Handbook. According to the Poisoner's Handbook, thallium gives the poisoner the ability to control how quickly their victim dies. The poisoning presents itself as a medical enigma, with the patient slowly deteriorating for unknown reasons. There were even more intriguing discoveries. In Ray's car, they found a canister of acetone and a packet of exotic seeds hidden in a small compartment in the spare tire. Additionally, Bridget's sister handed over a black garbage bag that she retrieved from the trash bin, as their mother noticed Ray throwing it away just before the police arrived. Inside were receipts for exotic seeds such as tick seed, prayer nut, and Cerbera odolum, along with various tools for their filtration and grinding. In other words, everything necessary for the production of rare poisons. It was evident that the man had already attempted to crush tick seeds to obtain ricin, a poison toxic to mice but dangerous to humans if inhaled or ingested. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there were no traces of thallium found in the house, garage, or car. Therefore, there was no basis for arresting Ray. All they could do was share their suspicions with Bridget and ask her not to return home. She still couldn't believe their words, but she didn't object to the continuation of the investigation. The investigators continued to dig deeper and discovered a possible motive for the murder. Ray had a lover who believed he was a widower. He lied to her, claiming to be a Navy SEAL and expressing his goal to work for the FBI in the poisoning division. He didn't hesitate to bring his young son on their dates, and the boy had grown so attached to the woman that he called her mom. Leading a double life, Ray went even further and started another affair, confessing to the woman that he was married. However, he hoped that his wife would be hit by a bus, so he wouldn't have to share custody of their son. It's unclear why this didn't alarm the woman. Nonetheless, it was clear that the man wanted to end his relationship with Bridget. But as a devout Catholic, she had warned him before their marriage that she did not believe in divorce and that if they married, it would be for life. She could hardly have expected her unfaithful husband to take this ending so literally. The detectives asked Ray to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. When the polygraph examiner informed him of the results, he didn't attempt to deny it and confessed to everything. Race stated that he ordered thallium online 3 times. In August 2017, he first attempted to add it to his wife's food by preparing her a sandwich for breakfast. He calculated the amount of thallium based on her weight. The next day, Bridget felt unwell, but it didn't kill her. She started to recover. In December of the same year, Race added a slightly larger amount of thallium to the soup. Again, he didn't achieve the desired effect. In January, he increased the dosage 5-fold and once again hid the poison in a sandwich. He intended to kill Bridget within days. She felt terrible, experienced excruciating pain, and began losing her hair, but she continued to fight for her life. After confessing, Race was arrested. 8 months later, he pleaded guilty to 3 attempts to murder his wife. His lawyer tried to argue that Race suffered a spinal injury while serving in the Navy, and the pain clouded his judgment. However, this defense did not help. On March 14, 2019, he was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments ranging from 21 years to life. He may be eligible for parole in October 2033. If he is lucky and succeeds in his first attempt at freedom, he will serve only 14 years in prison and become a free man before his 42nd birthday. During the trial, Bridget was finally able to address her husband personally. She said, "I wanted to believe that I knew the man I married 3 years ago, the man I had been dating for nearly 10 years. I wanted to believe that he would never harm me. I am horrified by the thought that he could be responsible for attempting to kill me. How could you do this to the mother of your child? Why do you think you have the right to decide that I am not a worthy mother for your son? How could you decide that the way to end our marriage is by slowly killing your wife, watching her suffer for months? I cared for you, and I loved you." Every time Bridget recalls the incident, she breaks into a cold sweat. She felt unwell and was lying in bed. Her husband brought her a sandwich with peanut butter. Their little son climbed onto the bed and asked for a bit. Race immediately shouted at her not to give him any. Bridget doesn't know if there was thallium in that sandwich, but she believes her son was at least on the brink of severe poisoning. Despite Bridget's reluctance to admit divorce, she eventually divorced Race. She still suffers from constant fatigue, weakness in her legs, and nerve damage. However, she is gradually recovering and has returned to work at a school for children with special needs. She admits that now it is much easier for her to find an approach to each student. Bridget, who once couldn't walk, is now running again, trying skydiving, and striving to live life to the fullest.
Two sisters on vacation to a paradise-like Hawaiian island. At least that's what other tourists might think, but they'd be wrong. This journey was closer to hell than heaven. The sisters arrived at the luxurious resort with one purpose: to uncover the mystery of what happened to their mother. They were prepared to search for answers alone, but received help from an unexpected source, beyond the grave. Their mother had hidden a clue for them in an envelope with the mundane label, "Childhood Photos." Even when the odds seem stacked against them, the sisters won't stop until they achieve justice. A promise turned obsession keeps them steadfast on their path. At the center of this story is Shirlene Van Gundy. Once crowned a beauty queen in her native Colorado, Shirlene was a truly stunning, charming, and fascinating woman, and an unconventional mother. Her daughters, Tammy and Tiffany, adored her. Shirlene acted more like their friend than a strict parent. As Tammy recalls, Shirlene often struggled to take care of herself, let alone anyone else. This may be why Tammy had to take on increasing responsibility for her younger sister and grow up faster than most. Shirlene was also, to put it mildly, emotionally unstable. Her mood swings were sudden and dramatic, and any discussion about them was strictly off limits. Breaking this unspoken rule inevitably led to arguments, as Shirlene refused to acknowledge she had any issues. After Shirlene separated from the girl's father, Tammy made the difficult decision not to go with her. Though she loved her mother deeply, she couldn't bring herself to leave her father behind. For years, the sisters lived apart until their father eventually gained custody of Tiffany as well. From then on, the girls loved and worried about their mother, but always from a distance. Then in the late 1980s, Shirlene told her daughters that she had finally found true happiness after meeting a man named Ken Wakisaka. He accepted and loved her just as she was, with all her quirks and mood swings. The two got married. Because Shirlene had always dreamed of living in Hawaii, Ken accepted a job offer on the islands and moved her to a spacious apartment in a great neighborhood. Of course, Shirlene's daughters met Ken, a chivalrous man who carried himself like a true gentleman. He made a good impression right away, and their mother seemed genuinely happy by his side. 10 years passed, the sisters grew up and started families of their own. Tammy settled in California while Tiffany moved to Arizona. That was how things stood at the beginning of 1998. However, Tammy and Tiffany began to realize that not everything was as smooth as it seemed when Shirlene admitted that she and Ken had been fighting. In mid-1999, the sisters managed to visit their mother to see for themselves what was happening. During that trip, Shirlene made an unusual request. She asked her daughters to promise that if anything ever happened to her, they would investigate what had occurred. Naturally, Tiffany and Tammy were surprised and asked, "Mom, what are you talking about? What do you mean if something happens?" Shirlene didn't elaborate but insisted they give her their word. Not long after that, Shirlene split from Ken. The sisters assumed it was a permanent separation and felt relieved. They were happy to see their mother spending time with them and her grandchildren. But then she vanished. For a week, they didn't hear anything from her until she finally reached out, saying she was back in Hawaii, back with Ken, and that everything was fine. She asked them not to worry. But the sisters had every reason to be concerned. Their mother's behavior became increasingly strange. Shirlene would call Tammy, talk about various things, and then call back an hour later, not remembering anything they had just discussed. This deeply upset Tammy, leaving her unsure of what to think. It got to the point where she often ignored her mother's calls. Naturally, she had no idea what was about to happen. On April 4th, 2000, Shirlene tried calling Tammy once again, but Tammy didn't answer the calls. Instead, Shirlene left several voicemail messages. There was nothing unusual about them. She told Tammy that she loved her, that she had found God, and that everything was fine. Tammy decided to wait until morning to call her mother back. When she finally did, it was Ken who picked up the phone. His words were blunt. "I don't know what's wrong with your mother. Talk to her." Tammy asked Shirlene what was happening, but her mother only replied, "I love you." Her words, however, were slurred and muffled, something Shirlene had never done before. Panicking, Tammy called her sister Tiffany and then immediately contacted Honolulu's emergency services, pleading with them to send an ambulance to her mother's house. At the same time, Tiffany managed to get through to Shirlene and was speaking with her on the phone when she heard the sound of an ambulance siren in the background. Tiffany felt a wave of relief, confident that her older sister, as usual, had everything under control. She was sure the paramedics would save their mother. However, the paramedics couldn't determine who needed help. In their report, they later noted that the 52-year-old patient was conscious and appeared calm, though her emotional and mental state raised concerns. She seemed unaware of the paramedics' presence. Her husband, Ken, told the medics that his wife had said to him, "I'm dying." He speculated that she might have taken sleeping pills along with a couple of bottles of beer. But the medics didn't find any empty bottles nearby, and there was no smell of alcohol on Shirlene herself. Based on their assessment, they concluded she wasn't under the influence of alcohol or any substances. As a result, the paramedics decided not to take Shirlene to the hospital and left her at home with her husband. Shirlene managed to speak to her younger daughter one more time, but every word she said was labored and difficult. Later that same day, at 2 p.m., Ken called the paramedics again. This time, they transported Shirlene to the hospital and admitted her to the intensive care unit. The doctors did everything they could, but their efforts were in vain. Ken informed Tammy that Shirlene was in a coma, barely clinging to life. Tammy immediately called Tiffany, and the sisters each rushed to the airport in their respective cities, heading straight to Hawaii. They didn't yet realize that the 6-hour flight would only be the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward justice, and how difficult it would be to fulfill the promise they'd made to their mother. At that moment, Tiffany and Tammy only knew one thing. Their mother was on life support, but they didn't yet understand why or what had happened to her. However, even this was enough for the sisters to call the Honolulu Police Department with their suspicions before they even boarded the plane. Naturally, all their concerns revolved around Ken. After landing, Tiffany called the hospital to check on their mother's condition. A hospital staff member informed her that there was no change in Shirlene's state and that Ken had gone home to feed the dogs. Tiffany couldn't believe it. She felt Ken had no right to leave Shirlene alone. When Detective Wayne Cambra, assigned to investigate the case, arrived at the hospital, he also found Ken's behavior suspicious. He wondered if Ken had gone home to clean up a crime scene. Doctors informed the detective that Shirlene had ingested a large dose of pills, and since treatment wasn't administered in time, she had fallen into a coma. Out of caution, Detective Cambra checked whether Ken had any prior run-ins with the law. It turned out that he had been arrested before, for assault. During the flight, Tiffany and Tammy had plenty of time to reflect on what Shirlene had told them 9 months earlier, when they promised to uncover the truth if anything ever happened to her. They didn't yet know what to look for, but they were certain they would find evidence in Ken and Shirlene's apartment. When they arrived, they told Ken they were exhausted from the long journey and asked if they could rest at his apartment. Of course, he handed over the keys and stayed by his wife's side at the hospital. He also gave them a sealed envelope, which they set aside on the back seat of their car for the time being. They were in a rush. The sisters searched the apartment and the surrounding property thoroughly. The doctors believed Shirlene's condition was due to a drug overdose, but Tiffany and Tammy were convinced that their mother hadn't taken the pills willingly. Determined to find evidence, they combed through the house and the yard. It was in the backyard, under a bush, that they discovered packaging from a medication. In their minds, there was only one person who could have hidden it there, Ken Wakisaka. As Tammy and Tiffany were about to get into the car, they remembered another piece of advice their mother had given them. Shirlene had told Tiffany that if anything happened to her, the sisters should ask Ken to give them their childhood photos. Then it hit them, that sealed envelope Ken had handed over. It was labeled childhood pictures, but what they found inside was something entirely different. The envelope contained notes written by Ken. It appeared to be an assignment from an anger management class, a kind of journal listing all the ways he had mistreated Shirlene. "I spat on Shirlene. I yelled at Shirlene. I pushed Shirlene," the notes read, all written in Ken's handwriting. This was the evidence Shirlene had left behind for her daughters. Suddenly, they realized that their mother had been leaving them clues, practically screaming from beyond the grave that she had been the victim of a crime. With the detective's support, they developed a plan to secretly record a phone conversation with Ken. Tammy called him from the police station, acting friendly and attempting to get him to open up. Ken confessed to Tammy that he was very worried about Shirlene, expressing how much he loved her and how lonely he felt without her. He and Tammy discussed the day in detail. Shirlene had told him she had taken the pills, and she had acted as if she were already saying goodbye to life, but nothing seemed to work. She kept repeating, "The pills aren't working. The pills aren't working." Then hesitating, Ken admitted that Shirlene had asked him to strangle her. But of course, he hadn't done it. Tammy asked if he had considered calling emergency services, but he thought she was just depressed and didn't know what to think. During the conversation, Ken also directly told Tammy that the sisters' behavior seemed suspicious to him. He thought they might try to accuse him of either involuntary manslaughter or murder. He repeatedly assured her that he hadn't harmed his wife, that he hadn't strangled her, and that doctors could check for signs of strangulation. Tammy and Tiffany believed they needed to act quickly. They felt that as long as their mother was alive, they had the right to search Ken and Shirlene's house and garage in California. However, when they left the island, Ken allowed the doctors to disconnect Shirlene from life support, and she passed away. Detective Wayne Cambra attended the funeral, and in his opinion, Ken's eulogy sounded more like a rehearsed defense speech for a trial. While it's true that not everyone is good at delivering speeches, the various details added up and further convinced the sisters that they had to fulfill their promise to their mother. They were determined to make sure Ken would be held accountable and sent to prison for her murder. The prosecutor took over the case and immediately became intrigued by Ken's mention of strangulation, especially since he had brought it up twice. Ken had mentioned this to the coroner as well, allegedly trying to convince him not to perform an autopsy, insisting that his wife had died of natural causes. However, the autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist concluded that Shirlene had died from brain damage caused by strangulation. Up until that point, Shirlene's death had been considered a drug overdose by everyone involved: the police, the hospital staff, and even her daughters, Tiffany and Tammy. Ken was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. In 2002, 2 years after Shirlene's death, her husband stood trial. The prosecution presented a series of key pieces of evidence. First and foremost, the coroner's conclusion about the cause of her death. Additionally, there was the secretly recorded conversation between Tammy and Ken, his recorded admissions of domestic violence, and the testimony of the sisters. The prosecution also revealed that during his separation from Shirlene, Ken had taken out a $150,000 life insurance policy on her, which, according to the prosecution, he later used to convince her to reconcile and return to him. Ken's defense attorney tried to argue that the police had rushed to conclusions and that this was not a murder. The defense even brought forward a coroner who admitted that Shirlene could have died from a heart attack rather than brain damage caused by strangulation. Ken never took the witness stand. Finally, after 2 weeks of court proceedings, Tiffany and Tammy heard the verdict. They were overjoyed when 46-year-old Ken was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. This could have been the end of the story, but an astonishing encounter, an interesting coincidence, would change everything. Attorney John Edmonds visited his client, the convicted murderer, in prison. The inmate told the lawyer that Ken didn't belong there and that there were many oddities and inconsistencies in his case. He asked Edmonds to meet with Ken. Edmonds wasn't used to seeking clients in prison, but he was intrigued by the man's words. He reviewed the trial materials and discovered a critical mistake made by the prosecutor. In his closing remarks, the prosecutor had directly accused the defendant of failing to take the witness stand. The prosecutor stated, "If the defendant does not tell us what happened that day, then all we can do is judge by what the body of Shirlene tells us." This was a gross error. The Fifth Amendment privilege is the right not to testify against oneself. It's a constitutional right, and the prosecutor cannot even comment on it. However, Ken's attorney didn't raise an objection, and the judge didn't address it either. The prosecutor later claimed that he misspoke and intended to say, "if he doesn't know," rather than "if he doesn't tell us." But it was a significant slip. This mistake became the foundation for an appeal that John Edmonds filed. By that time, Tiffany and Tammy had long forgotten about Ken. They believed the case was closed and assumed that all prisoners filed appeals, but that they were usually of little consequence. However, this appeal would turn out to be different. In 2003, 1 year after Ken was convicted, the Supreme Court overturned the verdict. However, this did not mean that Ken was declared innocent. He was released on bail, but the charges against him were not dropped, and a retrial could start at any time. Once again, his lawyer, John Edmonds, turned to the case files and began to study them carefully. What he found shocked him. He discovered a huge oversight by the prosecution that had occurred even before the trial. In the Wakisaka couple's apartment, there was a young man living there who was not related to them. He was simply renting a room. The grand jury, before the trial had even begun, had requested that this young man be called as a witness. Normally, when a grand jury asks for a witness to be called, the prosecutor is obligated to comply. However, the prosecutor failed to call the witness, even though his importance to the case was undeniable. as he could have known more about what happened to Shirlene. On the fateful morning of her death, the young man had been home, and the events unfolded before his eyes. What was even more intriguing was that, although the grand jury never heard his testimony, Detective Canberra had spoken to him. The young man told him that on the day of Shirlene's death, she had asked Ken to stay with her because she wanted to die in peace. This indicated that indeed she had been contemplating death that day. However, the jury never heard this. Attorney John Edmonds returned to court with these new materials and won the case. The murder charge against his client was dropped. Ken Wakisaka was now not just released on bail, but fully free. However, he was not declared innocent. If he had been found innocent, according to the law, he could not have been tried again for the same crime. But as things stood, there remained a possibility of a retrial. Interestingly, there was another witness who knew both Cheryl and Ken. Marjorie Collier works as a manager of the apartment complex where the couple lived. Unlike Tiffany and Tammy, Marjorie knew for certain that it was Cheryl who was the instigator of all the arguments. Cheryl had once casually told Marjorie that Ken was her complete opposite. He never argued with her or raised his voice. In case of a disagreement, he would prefer to go outside for a walk to clear his mind. Cheryl didn't like that. On April 5th, when Tammy called an ambulance to their mother's house, Marjorie was also there at work. She spoke with the paramedics, who told her that Cheryl was conscious and fully aware of what was happening, enough to refuse to go with them. The paramedics' report noted that Ken had decided his wife didn't need to go to the hospital, but Marjorie was told by the paramedics that Cheryl had refused to go herself. Later, when Marjorie learned that Ken was accused of killing his wife, she couldn't believe it. She had her own version of what might have happened between the couple. Her assumptions were based on an incident that occurred when Cheryl came into her office. She was loud and insisted on being seen immediately. Marjorie had come to close the door since she hadn't started work yet. It was still early, but as she was closing the door, she accidentally hit Cheryl on the arm, causing her to spill a cup of coffee. Marjorie didn't think much of it until a police officer arrived and threatened her with arrest for assault. Cheryl had called the police. The woman claimed that the spilled coffee had burned her legs. But even the officer could see that one cup of coffee couldn't cause such severe burns on both of her legs, from her thighs to her feet. The only conclusion was that Cheryl had injured herself. She was willing to harm herself just to frame Marjorie. So Marjorie developed her own theory about how the woman had died. Of course, this is just her version, but she believes that Cheryl wanted to make it appear as though her husband had tried to kill her, but she went too far and ended up dying. However, of course, Cheryl's daughters could not be persuaded. They continued to demand a retrial, but the former prosecutor was no longer working in the office, and the new one was in no rush to move forward with the case. Confident that his client would again be accused of murder, attorney John Edmonds sought help from a well-known pathologist who firmly stated that Cheryl did not die from strangulation. The marks that were believed to be signs of strangulation were actually caused by the tubes that had been inserted into her mouth and had pressed against her throat during her 5 days in the hospital. In response, the new prosecutor hired other experts who, unexpectedly for him, confirmed that Cheryl had not been strangled. As a result, in 2010, the prosecutor's office announced that it was abandoning the strangulation theory, the very theory that had been used to charge Ken back in 2002. In an email to Cheryl's daughters dated January 22, 2014, the new prosecutor wrote that the district attorney had given the green light for Ken to be tried for murder resulting from criminal negligence. That is, they wanted to accuse him of failing to provide medical help to his wife, which ultimately led to her death. However, the case was never brought to trial. Attorney John Edmonds argues that this theory could be easily disproven, as Ken had indeed tried to help Cheryl by calling 911. There was also the issue of the pill bottle found under the bush near the couple's house. However, during the 2002 trial, Detective Canberra testified that on April 6th, after Cheryl was admitted to the hospital, he visited the couple's apartment in search of possible evidence, suggesting that the woman had intended to take her own life. Ken was at home and showed the detective a medicine cabinet which contained a white bottle with red pills. The detective did not seize it that day, but on April 8th, he was told that Tiffany and Tammy had found an empty bottle of medication under the bush. However, on April 6th, the detective had carefully examined that part of the yard and the bushes, and he was sure that no pill bottles had been there at the time. He was convinced that this was the same bottle he had seen on April 6th. This was intriguing, but in any case, the bottle contained anti-seizure medication, which Cheryl had been taking and which is sold without a prescription. However, a non-lethal amount of a completely different medication used to treat heart arrhythmias was found in her system. But even here, it would not be possible to prove that Ken was hiding something or trying to conceal evidence. On the contrary, when the paramedics arrived, he also showed them the medicine cabinet, where the medical staff counted the remaining pills in the bottle to determine how many she had taken. Moreover, the attorney could have proven that in the final days, Cheryl was emotionally unstable. Her doctor had prescribed her medication to help her cope with her emotional state and even wanted to admit her to a psychiatric clinic for treatment. Tiffany and Tammy were certain that within a couple of years the case would be brought back to court, but the years have continued to pass without any attempts to recharge Ken, and it remains unclear whether such attempts will ever be made. Meanwhile, the sisters continue to review all the case files in the hope of finding another clue. Their husbands and children often have to go without their wives and mothers, who are conducting their own investigation. But the women believe they cannot live peacefully without fulfilling the promise they made to their mother, a promise that has become an obsession, preventing them from veering off course. Room 113 in the dormitory of the prestigious Jian School was shared by several girls. All of them were 17, in their final year, and top of their class. The pressure was unreal. Studying around the clock, no distractions, only books and discipline. But the girls were close friends. They shared news, joys, and sorrows. That's why what happened one winter night in the middle of the school year came as such a shock. By morning, only one of them was still alive, and her story is stranger than fiction. At the center of this story is John's school, but this was no ordinary school. Proudly located in Tianjin, China, it had the reputation of being one of the top academic institutions in the country, if not the very best. Students fortunate enough to pass through its gates were destined for the nation's most prestigious universities. But prestige came at a price. All students were required to live on campus, regardless of how close their homes were to the school. Boys and girls lived in separate dormitories, each governed by strict rules and under constant video surveillance. Leaving the dorms was only permitted with written approval from both a teacher and dorm administration. The winter morning of December 23, 1998, at John School's dormitory began like any other. The girls were climbing out of their warm beds and hurrying to wash up and prepare for class. But something was preventing the girls from room 112 from getting ready, a strange smell. They stepped into the hallway trying to find the source and realized the odor was seeping from under the door of room 113, their neighboring room. While the others hesitated, unsure of what to do, one girl stepped forward and gently knocked on the door. When there was no response, she gave it a slight push. The door opened easily. The moment the door swung open, the girl was nearly knocked off her feet by a strong, sharp, and overwhelmingly foul odor. Then she saw the bodies. Some of the girls were lying in their beds, others sprawled on the floor, their hair splayed out, arms and legs twisted into the most unnatural positions. It looked like a scene straight out of hell. One girl was curled up in the fetal position. Others lay as if they had collapsed mid-step. What the students saw was blood, urine, vomit, dried foam at the corners of mouths, broken fingernails, and scratch marks on the floor. She screamed in terror. Her friends came running. Some fainted on the spot, others fled in horror. The dormitory supervisor, hearing the commotion upstairs, arrived and saw the same horrifying scene. Fighting back nausea with all her strength, she called the police. Police officers and medics rushed to the scene. The ambulance arrived quickly, but all the victims had been dead for some time. There was nothing anyone could do. Even though emergency personnel had been informed about the nature of the call, they were still shocked by the horrific scene that awaited them in room 113. There were 7 of them, 7 17-year-old girls, roommates. Some of the unfortunate students were lying on their backs, faces twisted in grimaces, their unseeing eyes staring toward the door. Foam covered the mouths of several girls. One girl, lying on her bed, was clutching a doll so tightly that her fingernails had left deep imprints in it. Forensic examiners couldn't even pry her fingers away. Another girl had clearly tried to crawl across the floor. She had scratched at it so violently that her nails had been torn off, leaving raw flesh and blood behind. Under some of the girls, the floor was soiled with excrement as they had lost control of their bodily functions in death, adding an even more unbearable odor to the room. But the most disturbing part was their eyes. All of their pupils had shrunk to the size of pinpricks. Aside from the bodies, police found fruit in the room, as well as a small knife, presumably used to cut the fruit. There were also cups with a bit of water left in them. The police sent the bodies and the evidence for analysis, determined to find out exactly how the schoolgirls had died. While police officers continued their investigation, They interviewed other students and dormitory staff. That's when they learned that the strange smell had actually appeared the night before. On the evening of December 22nd, around midnight as the girls were getting ready for bed, some of them noticed an odd odor. It didn't resemble the usual smells of a dormitory. It was sharp and chemical. At the time, they couldn't determine its exact source, so they turned to the dorm supervisor. The supervisor also noticed the smell, especially near rooms 113, 112, 111, and 110. But since it was already late, she decided not to disturb the girls in those rooms. Instead, she tried to contact the school administration, but no one answered the phone. So she walked the girls over to the teacher's building, hoping to find someone on duty or to reach their homeroom teacher. That attempt also failed. By the time they returned, it was past 1 a.m. Not wanting the girls to oversleep and miss classes the next day, the supervisor advised them to go to bed. She planned to look into the matter in the morning. Everyone dispersed. And yet, if only they had insisted on opening those few rooms that night, maybe the victims would have had a chance to survive. Surely both the students and the supervisor blamed themselves for not making that decision. But how could they have known? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in a school dormitory? After speaking with the dorm supervisor, the police noticed another detail. Most of the rooms in the dormitory housed 8 students, including room 113. But there were only 7 bodies in the room. Where was the 8th girl? Had she somehow escaped the tragedy? Or had she been taken by the perpetrator? No one knew. The police immediately shifted their focus to searching for the missing student. Imagine their astonishment when she appeared on her own. The girl's name was San. After the investigation had already begun, one of her classmates ran into her at the school sports field. While police were searching high and low for her, she had been freely moving around the school. Officers quickly approached San and asked where she had been the previous night. Had she gone anywhere? San innocently replied that she hadn't gone anywhere and had simply slept peacefully in the room. But if she had truly been in that room, she must have known how her roommates died, and yet she insisted she had no idea. The situation grew surreal. Police couldn't believe that she had spent the night in a room where 7 girls died and supposedly knew nothing about it. They spoke with her for a long time, trying to get the truth, but she stubbornly stuck to her story. Finally, the results from the laboratory arrived. They confirmed what investigators had suspected. The girls had been poisoned. However, no one could have imagined what they were poisoned with. The cause of death was organophosphate poisoning, specifically parathion. Parathion, also known as thiophos, is an organophosphate compound, a powerful insecticide that is extremely toxic to humans. It primarily affects the nervous system. The lethal dose is just 2 milligrams. The poison starts to act within 10 minutes, leading to the failure of the muscles involved in breathing, and a deadly amount of fluid builds up in the lungs. Specialists found the pesticide in the victims' digestive systems and vomit, as well as in the cups located at the crime scene. This meant that all 7 girls had ingested the poison in the dormitory. But how could such a toxic pesticide end up in a school dorm? The food in the cafeteria was tested, no toxic substances were found, and access to the cafeteria was restricted to school personnel, so the poisoner couldn't have come from outside. Surveillance footage and school staff also confirmed that no strangers had entered the building that night. That meant the poison could only have been added by someone already inside. And yet, only the girls from room 113 were affected. All the other students in the school were perfectly fine. For understandable reasons, San, who lived in the same room, became the main suspect. Police took her fingerprints and compared them to those found on the cups. Her prints were indeed on all the cups at the crime scene, as well as on the small knife used for cutting fruit. But that alone didn't prove anything. After all, she lived in that room. However, another group of officers managed to uncover a crucial lead. They traced the source of the parathion to a store that sold it. The shopkeeper clearly remembered the buyer. It's not every day that a high school girl purchases a dangerous chemical. The store employee reported that a ½ kilogram of parathion was bought by a high school student. When the police asked him to identify the customer, he immediately pointed to San. All the collected evidence pointed directly at her. But there was one thing the police couldn't understand. Even in diluted form, parathion has an extremely strong and pungent odor. It's nearly impossible not to notice. Moreover, its toxicity spreads quickly, causing severe pain. If even one girl had ingested the poison a bit earlier than the others, the rest would have noticed immediately, and they would have had time to call for help. The poisoner had to not only make sure all the girls took the poison at the same time, but also prevent anyone nearby from hearing their cries for help. If San was the killer, how did she manage to solve both of these problems? One frail girl against 7. How did she stop them from calling for help? How did she convince them to drink the poison? The police began to suspect that perhaps the immense pressure on the students or some external influence had led the girls to take the poison collectively. But their teachers and classmates insisted that the girls had been cheerful, high-achieving, and had bright futures ahead. There was no way they would do something like that. At the same time, investigators had already confirmed that no one heard sounds of struggle or cries for help that night. It became clear. To get to the truth, they would have to convince San to tell them what really happened. The investigators listed all the evidence they had gathered so far. Tension in the interrogation room was rising. Even though San initially appeared calm and composed, even capable of withstanding intense psychological pressure, she was still just a 17-year-old girl. And finally, the quiet, collected student broke down. She covered her face with her hands, started crying, and began to speak. But the truth she told the police had nothing to do with what they had expected. San admitted that she had indeed purchased the insecticide, but she insisted she did not kill her roommates. Lu did, she said. The name Lu was familiar to the police. She was one of the 7 victims found in room 113. Her cause of death was identical to the others. Could someone be both the killer and a victim at the same time? The police still had serious doubts about San's story, but San said that everything that happened in room 113 was part of a plan by her best friend Lu. Even in such a prestigious school, where classes were always a priority because everything was aimed at excellent exam results and admission to the best universities in China, teenagers remained teenagers. Lu's thoughts hadn't been about lessons for several months. In September 1997, Lu started dating a boy. Such romantic relationships were not approved at school, but that didn't stop the young people. From the day Lu entered the world of romance, it seemed that only her boyfriend existed for her. However, teenage love often turns out to be short-lived. Less than a year passed before the boy broke up with Lu. For her, this news was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. She tried to save the relationship, but was met with an even harsher rejection from her boyfriend. Of course, Lu shared her feelings with her best friend San, but even sharing her pain with her friend didn't make it go away. She couldn't cope and reached the breaking point where she thought about death. The girl asked San to buy pesticides for her. Most people would never agree to fulfill such a request. So San refused her friend, but Lu insisted, wouldn't leave San alone, constantly describing her suffering after losing her boyfriend. San fell under the influence of Lu's love-blinded mind and reluctantly agreed. The girl seized a moment when she could leave the school, found a store that sold pesticides, and bought a bottle of parathion. Lu, having obtained the pesticide, suddenly seemed to calm down. She told her friend that she would drink it that very evening, putting an end to the pain caused by her lost love. However, after all the girls in the room had finished their homework and were getting ready to go to bed, Lu unexpectedly changed her mind. No, she didn't change her mind about drinking the parathion, but she turned to San with an even more absurd request. The girl said that going to another world alone was too lonely. Therefore, she decided that all the roommates would go with her. "You're my best friend. Can you help me one more time?" She shocked San with an even wilder request. This request went beyond all bounds. What had the other girls done besides being unlucky enough to be Lu's roommates? Why should they share her choice? Incredible as it was, San agreed. That very evening, they began to carry out the plan. Lu personally mixed the insecticide with honey and fruit juice to slightly mask its bitter taste and poured a cup for each roommate, except for San. She told her friends that it was medicine her mother had prepared and sent to prevent tuberculosis, which was currently raging in the city. Several cases of the disease had already been registered at school, and 6 students had to go home, missing classes, which could ruin their chances of getting into university. Therefore, all the other students were very afraid of getting sick. When Lu said that her mother, a doctor, had made the medicine for everyone, the girls believed her, willingly took their cups, and even thanked Lu. However, the medicine had a strange smell. The girls couldn't hide their disgust, but Lu waved off their complaints, explaining that all herbal medicines naturally have a strange odor. Saying this, she raised her cup and drank it all down. The other girls stopped grumbling and also drank the medicine, except for San. San explained that she had already drunk her portion at lunch. She watched as the 7 girls, including her best friend, drank the poisonous potion, believing that traditional Chinese medicine would protect them from tuberculosis. The girls didn't leave even a drop in their cups. After that, there was no turning back. The effect of the pesticide appeared very quickly. The process of organophosphate poisoning is incredibly painful. The schoolgirls couldn't bear the hellish pain and began to moan, but San reassured everyone that the pain was a normal reaction to the medicine. When she had taken it during the day, she too had felt discomfort like the others. But soon it passed. San stayed close to her friends, comforting them, urging them to stay calm and not disturb the other girls in the dormitory while sleeping. Incredibly, her words had a magical effect. 6 schoolgirls turned out to be truly kind-hearted people, and despite the terrible pain, they felt it was unacceptable to disturb the others' sleep, so they did not scream. San continued to play the role of the perfect friend. She gave the girls hot water and peeled apples for them, taking care of them as if they were sick. Looking at her at that moment, no one would have guessed that she was a devil watching her roommates die in agony without even raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, the girls clung to various objects nearby, hoping to endure the pain as San had promised. But even after eating the fruit, their symptoms did not improve at all. On the contrary, the agony intensified. Perhaps they suspected something. But by that time, they no longer had the strength to scream. One girl fell from the bed and crawled across the room to the door, scratching the floor with her nails, trying to get out into the corridor and attract someone's attention. But she remained lying on the floor with torn nails, unable to move any further. The poor girl died with wide-open eyes. The lives of the roommates gradually slipped away in a silent struggle. Losing the fight against the terrible poison, they left this world one by one. Sitting nearby, San simply watched what was happening. After all the roommates succumbed to the poison, San just lay down to sleep as if nothing had happened. Just imagine the scene. 7 girls frozen in horrifying poses in a tiny little room. The air was filled with the stench of excrement and vomit. Even thinking about it is enough to make your hair stand on end. Yet San calmly slept on her bed next to her 7 dead friends. When she woke up, she simply stepped over the bodies and went to her classes. The police were shocked by this story. When investigators asked why she didn't just refuse Liu, why she didn't leave when the girls drank the poison, San answered, "She was my best friend. I had to help her." And there was no trace of remorse in her voice. The investigators had no doubt that the girl's story was a hastily concocted lie. San was shifting the blame onto her dead friend, who could no longer defend herself. But an unexpected clue made the detectives reconsider, thinking that this wild story might actually be true. The police found a note from Liu hidden under her bed. They did not disclose the full contents of the note, but Liu explained the reason for her insane act, and it really was love, just as San had said. She also explained why she took all the roommates with her, except San. The note contained words like these: "My dear friend, keep living and enjoying life. I am upset and lack the courage to take you with me. Forgive me for not listening to your advice and for hurting you so much. Everything that happened today is my just punishment. Don't hate or be angry with me." After discovering the note, the police compared the handwriting and confirmed it was written by Liu. Now they had confirmation of San's story. Still, the actions of the surviving girl were beyond rational explanation. To help a friend like that and watch 6 people die, this was beyond any norms. Psychologists suggested that San might be a psychopath. She was simply incapable of empathy. Therefore, she could not truly understand Liu's suffering. Seeing the deaths of her roommates, she felt no fear or guilt. In any case, her criminal actions could not be denied. On December 24, 1998, San was charged. On July 28, 1999, the court delivered its verdict in this case. Taking into account Liu's note and the autopsy results, the court believed that San had purchased the pesticide at Liu's request and helped her commit the crime. Thus, the primary responsibility for the deaths of the 6 girls lay with Liu, while San's role was secondary. However, since her actions were no less shocking, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The defendant was dissatisfied and tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that she only bought the pesticide and did not know it was poisonous. The judge immediately rejected this claim, stating that the school where the girls studied was known for its excellent education. As a senior student, she could not have been unaware that drinking pesticide could be deadly. San continued to file appeals, but all were denied. The families of the 6 deceased students demanded compensation. They requested 1.5 million Chinese yuan in total, 250,000 yuan for each family. However, the court ruled that each family would receive 1,000 yuan to cover funeral expenses and approximately 50,000 yuan as compensation for the death of their loved ones. Liu's family was ordered to pay 45% of the amount, San's family 30%, and the school would cover the remaining 25%. It seemed the verdict was clear, and the criminal would spend the rest of her life in prison where she belonged. However, thanks to her excellent behavior and the fact that San was a minor at the time of the crime, her sentence was reduced to 15 years. She was released in 2013. Afterwards, she changed her name and disappeared, became a ghost. The only person who knew what really happened that night vanished from sight. It is said she is married, has children, and lives a normal life. To this day, debates continue about whether San was the puppeteer or merely a puppet, controlled by Liu's dark resolve. But regardless of who planned the murder, who poured the poison into the cups on that fateful night, 6 innocent girls were denied the justice they deserved. Their names are engraved on gravestones as victims of murder, although they should have entered China's history for a very different reason. Could those girls have imagined that the medicine given by their friend's mother could be a deadly poison? But even more incredible is that someone would not want to die alone and would take all their roommates with them, and all because of a first school love.